Behind her, the door slammed shut, and the sound drowned out all the other sounds in the room. Iron against iron, a deep final boom that vibrated through the stone floor and up through the soles of her feet. Naya didn't blink. She'd learned long ago that flinching only made them look harder. The Silverthorn court chamber smelled as it always did, of beeswax candles and old parchment, and underneath it all, the faint metallic tang of nerves. Hers. Their own. If she dared to reach for it, it was everyone's. But she didn't. Not over here. Not in a room full of wolves that would smell her fear before they smelled anything else about her. She knelt on the floor in the middle of the room, because that's what you're supposed to do, and because if she had stood up, her knees would have wobbled. Around her stood the nobles of the Silverthorn court, in a wide, glittering ring, silks in blue and silver, faces etched with a solemn concern that didn't reach their eyes. She counted them the way she counted everything when she was scared. It was a habit, a tether, something to do with her mind besides scream. 12 sets of eyes, and not one of them looked like they wanted the truth. A steward coughed at the edge of the circle, and the sound snapped through the silence like a broken branch. Let the accused stand and be judged by the Alpha King. Naya stood. She had a straight spine. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and they were not shaking. She had seen to that, digging her nails into her palms hard enough to leave crescents. Pain was a good caller. The pain kept her tied to her body, not hovering somewhere far above it, watching from the ceiling like a ghost at her own execution. She hated how easily the thought came. Phantom. Even now, even here. The steward cracked the wax seal and unrolled a scroll. It was a sound too loud for the smallness of the deed. A binding mark, he said, found under the eastern watchtower, death magic, forbidden under Silverthorn law for 300 years. He turned the scroll so the room could see it, and Naya's stomach dropped to the floor. Ink black, sharp lines curling at the edges, assembled into a shape she recognized immediately, because it could be mistaken for her own mark. It was close enough to convict her without a single witness to the truth. But hers not. She knew her own writing. She knew the exact angle of her wrist when she wrote. Her lines always dipped half a degree too far to the left. This mark didn't bend. This mark was stiff, studied, made by someone who had looked closely enough at her work to almost get it right. Not quite good enough. Almost. Not for her. But she doubted anyone in this room was watching closely enough to tell the difference. "This is not my mark," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt, and that was a small victory in itself. Nobody was there to answer. The steward just rolled the scroll back up, as if her denial had never been uttered. And that silence, that flat, practiced silence, told her everything about how this was going to go. Somewhere silk rustled behind her, a sleeve, adjusted slowly, deliberately, a whisper of fabric on skin. Naya didn't look back. She wouldn't have to. She could sense the smile she wasn't looking at already. Her pulse quickened, a slow beat behind her ribs. Instead, she turned her head to the dais at the front of the room, to the one chair that rose above all the others, to the one man in this court who could end it with a single word, and he was already looking at her. She got nothing at all from his face. Darian's eyes were the color of wet slate, and at the moment were just as cold. Naya had spent 3 years learning every variation of that face. The soft one, for the dark of their chambers, when the crown came off and he was just a man tracing slow lines down her spine. The one in charge kept for his generals, jaw tight, voice like a closing door. She had thought, stupidly now she saw, that she had catalogued every version there was. This was a new one, and it scared her more than the scroll ever could. He looked at her as a king would look upon a petition of a stranger. Polite. Far away. He was on his way to making a decision he'd already made, when she spoke. "My king." The second word stuck in her throat, and she hated it. Hated that her body still betrayed her before her mind could catch up after everything. "I didn't put this mark here. I would never." "The evidence says otherwise." The voice that cut her off wasn't his. Lady Seraphine stepped back from the circle, slowly, smoothing the silk at her wrists, as if she had all the time in the world, which Naya supposed she did. That had been the point of a trial that had already been decided. "I saw her," Seraphine said, "at the Eastern Tower. 3 nights ago. alone, muttering things I didn't understand and don't care to repeat in present company. A falsehood, a tidy, well-rehearsed lie, spoken with just enough hesitation to sound reluctant. Naya's jaw tightened. That isn't true. Careful, Seraphine said softly, and there it was. There was the smile that Naya had felt without seeing. Nothing, happy. The smile of a man who has already won and is just waiting for the room to catch up. Calling a member of this court a liar is a crime in itself, is it not? There was muttering from the circle. Not for Naya. Not for Naya. She looked again at Darian, because he was still the only one who could stop this, and some small, stupid, hopeful part of her still believed he would. Darian, not my king, not this night. Just his name, naked and pleading, the way she used to say it into his shoulder in the dark. Look at me, you know I wouldn't. Something glimmered in his eyes, only for a breath, a crack in the rock, and then it was gone, smoothed over so quickly that she might have imagined it. He said the court heard the evidence. His voice was emotionless, the formal, her maid's face, a stranger's voice. We have heard the testimony in court. Darian. Silence. One word. It was a punch in the nose. Naya's mouth closed on the rest of what she'd meant to say. Her whole body froze, the way prey freezes, some ancient animal part of her, knowing the moment before the strike. She'd been pleading with her eyes for 3 long seconds. 3 seconds where she threw him everything she had, exposed and unprotected, more fragile than she had ever been in front of a room full of people who wanted her gone. His eyes had looked right through her, as if she were smoke, as if she wasn't standing there. And in that moment, something inside her chest went very still. Not broken, not yet. Just quiet. The quiet of a house before it first begins to fall. When the steward read the next charge, Naya's mind did what it always did, when the fear became too big to contain. It went away. Not long. Just far enough. It was 11 years ago, back to that night when she was 7, standing at the edge of her mother's grave in the pouring rain, watching a shape that no one else could see. Her mother had been there, right there, not buried, standing, drenched in rain that hadn't fallen on her, smiling the same tired, gentle smile she'd worn every night before bed, for as long as Naya could remember. Mama, she had whispered, and reached out a little hand to a woman who had been dead for 2 days. The scream that followed hadn't been Naya's. She'd had it with her aunt's. Her niece grabbing for empty air and talking to it as though it could talk back. Whispers started that week, and they were cursed. A little girl who can see the dead. A little girl who couldn't be trusted with anything alive. She learned to stop reaching after that, to ignore the shapes passing through the corners of her vision as one would ignore the stare of a stranger on a busy street. She'd learned not to move her face when the air went cold for no reason, when the candles guttered although no wind had touched them, when a presence brushed past her shoulder that no living wolf could smell. Most days, Naya almost believed that girl was gone, she had buried her so deep. But sitting here, in a court built on a lie, watching the last of her mate's warmth freeze in front of an audience, she understood with an almost peaceful clarity why she'd spent her whole life in hiding. For this was what happened when you let yourself be seen. Even the ones that were supposed to love you, and by them especially. The steward's voice pulled her back into herself. And so the court recommends formal severance, pending the king's word. Severance. The word hit somewhere below her ribs, and stayed there, cold and heavy. Naya's eyes found Darian's again, one last time. She looked for any sign in his face. Regret, hesitation, the ghost of the man who once drew slow circles on her spine in the dark. There was nothing she could hold on to. His jaw was locked. He had square shoulders. Whatever war raged behind that slate-gray gaze, he'd already decided who was going to win. Somewhere behind her, she heard Seraphine's breath hitch, quick and shallow, the unmistakable rhythm of someone trying very hard not to smile too openly. Instead, Naya focused on breathing slowly. 4 in, hold 4, out, 4. Old trick, a trick of a dead girl. Learned in the quiet after too many nights of being told what she was. Taught to her by nobody. They wanted a monster? She'd give them the one they had already decided on. Shh! Can't read. Long gone before she even left the room. Darian rose from his throne, and the entire chamber rose with him, a wave of silken silence, each noble bowing in practiced deference. Naya did not change. Get up, still, watching him with her own stillness, one that had nothing to do with respect. "By the law of the Silverthorn pack," he said, and his voice rang out to every corner of the chamber without him having to raise it. "The mate bond between the crown and Naya of no formal house is, as of this hour, suspended." The words struck her like something physical, not noisy, nothing extraordinary, just final, like the sound of a door closing for the last time, not slammed. Suspended, such a clean, bureaucratic little word for what it was, a tear, a silence where warmth had lived, just below her sternum, right where the bond had always pulsed, low and steady, from the night they first touched. She felt it go out like a snuffed candle. Her hand flew to her chest before she could stop it, an animal instinct, unthinking, reaching for a wound that bled bloodless. Darian's gaze flicked to the hand, just for a moment, and there too, same crack she had seen before, gone as fast as it had appeared. If he felt anything, he hid it deep down. "The investigation into the Eastern Tower binding mark will continue," he said, turning to the steward, moving on, as though he hadn't just severed something that had taken 3 years to build and 1 scroll to destroy. "The accused shall remain in the northern wing until the proceedings are concluded. Locked up, not cleared, no mercy of doubt even granted." Naya's ears were ringing faintly, a high, thin sound under the murmur of the court beginning to disperse, satisfied, their entertainment over for the evening. She didn't recall deciding to move. One moment she was standing in the center of the circle, her hands still flat over her ribs, and the next her feet were carrying her toward the chamber doors. Past Seraphine's carefully composed face, past nobles who parted for her, as people part for something they'd rather not touch. She halted at the doors, only for a breath, long enough to look back one last time. Darian had not moved away from his place beside the throne. He watched her walk away, his face unreadable in the candlelight, hands curled into fists at his sides that he did not seem to notice. She waited for him to speak. Her name was, sorry, anything at all. He didn't say anything, so she turned around and walked out of those same iron doors that had slammed shut on her not 20 minutes ago, and this time no one stopped her. On her left was the north wing, confinement, laughter, cold stone and a locked door, and a court that had already made up its mind what she was. She didn't veer left. Beneath the castle, past the training yards and the old shrine that no one ever visited anymore, was a gate that every child in Silverthorn was taught to fear before they were taught their own names. A gate down into a place where the dead were kept, where the living were not meant to go. Then Naya turned right, toward the dark, and didn't look back again. The betrothal cuff felt cold against her wrist by the time she reached the old training yards. Colder than it had any right to be for silver that had sat against her skin for 3 years. Naya stopped under the archway where no torches burned, where the moon did most of the work the castle's light couldn't reach. She breathed out a thin white cloud. She could still hear the murmur of the court breaking up somewhere behind her, the nobles trading gossip about the trial like it was nothing more than an evening's entertainment. She glanced down at the cuff. She'd gotten it from Darian the night the bond had first settled, when his hands hadn't quite learned to be careful with her, when he'd fumbled the clasp twice before getting it right, and laughed, actually laughed, low and surprised at himself, like a man who wasn't used to being clumsy at anything. The man was dead. Maybe he was never real at all. Maybe he had always been a mask for the one who had stood on that dais tonight and said suspended as if it cost him nothing at all. Her fingers found the catch. It wouldn't give. 3 years of wear had fused the mechanism just enough to make her work for it. And some small, furious part of her was glad. She wanted it to sting. She wanted her hands to remember tearing it off, long after the rest of her had gone numb. Then at last, the clasp snapped with a metallic snap. The cuff hit the stone floor and didn't shatter. Silver was stronger than that. But the sound it made rolling once, twice before settling still, was somehow the loudest thing she'd heard all night. Louder than the court doors. That word is louder than suspended. She looked down at it, small and dull in the moonlight, and waited for the enormous feeling to come. What she felt instead was silence, a terrible clean quiet, the kind that comes when a wound has gone numb. And she'd left it in the dirt. Some steward will find it in the morning and wonder. If he cared enough to ask, Darian need never hear of it. Without it, it felt odd in her wrist, less weighty, exposed, like a scar feels when you finally stop covering it with a sleeve. She flexed her fingers once, trying out the strange freedom of it, and turned her face toward the tree line beyond the training yards, toward the old path that led down past the shrine no one visited, down toward the place every child in Silverthorn learned to fear, before they learned their own names. Above her, in the castle she was leaving, the bond that had throbbed steady under her ribs for 3 years was cold and empty. She did not look back to see if anyone had missed her. Before the path, the gate came into view and didn't make sense, and Mia gave up long ago on expecting things to make sense down here. It grew out of the hillside as though grown there instead of built. Black iron twisted into shapes that looked like reaching hands if she let her eyes go soft and didn't try to make sense of the pattern. No torches lit the way. No guards were posted. There was no need for anyone to guard a place that everyone already knew better than to go into. The Necropolis. The word was one she'd heard 100 times growing up, in a hushed voice, always followed by a quick sign against evil. A resting place for the dead. Every alpha that had ever ruled over Silverthorn and had died wearing the crown had a tomb. A place where the living who entered never came out again. Mia stopped a few feet from the gate, and let herself be afraid for exactly 3 seconds. She earned it. Then she went forward. The air changed the moment she stepped over some invisible line in the dirt. Colder, but not the regular cold of an autumn night. Some meat on this cold. It was like something inquisitive pushing at her skin, testing, deciding if she was one of them. Her boots crunched on gravel that smelled faintly of ash and something sweeter underneath, like lilies sitting too long in a vase. She reached the gate itself, laid her palm flat against the cold iron, half expecting it to burn her, half expecting nothing. What she got instead was a hum, deep in her bones, as if a held breath was finally let go. The gate opened with a groan on hinges that must have been seized by centuries of rust. No hand had touched it, no key had been turned. It saw something in her, and it gave way. Mia's heart pounded against her ribs. "Okay," she whispered, to no one, to the dark, to whatever awaited outside. In all that silence her voice was very small. "Okay." And she stepped through. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world outside, the court, the trial, the cuff lying broken on cold stone somewhere behind her, felt impossibly far away, like a story she'd been told about someone else's life. Ahead of her a long corridor vanished into darkness, lined with alcoves she couldn't yet see clearly. Somewhere deep within, she thought she heard something breathe. She should have been more frightened than she was. Instead, standing in a place built to keep the dead and warn away the living, Mia felt something she hadn't felt inside that glittering court chamber in years. She felt as if she was. The gate closed behind her with a soft final noise, locking her into the dark. She didn't see what happened to Darian at the moment it happened. She felt only the echo of it, the phantom ache that bloomed behind her sternum with such suddenness it stole the breath from her lungs. Mia staggered, her hand flying out to the wall of the corridor for support. Stone. Cold. Real stone. But the pain wasn't hers. Not exactly. It flowed through her as if it were borrowed. As if it were static crackling down a wire that shouldn't still be connected. She put her palm flat against her chest, right where the bond used to live. Right where it had gone cold and quiet the instant Darian said the word suspended. It was not silent anymore. It was shrieking. Not with noise, with feeling, a ripping raw feeling, as if someone very far away had just felt the same wound rip open twice. She didn't understand. The bond was meant to be broken, cut off, nothing, a clean little bureaucratic word that had been supposed to mean nothing. It no longer tugged at her, and yet here she was, doubled a bit at the waist, in a stone corridor half a mile underneath the castle, feeling for one impossible involuntary second an echo of a man on his knees. What? The word was breathless, a half-question she could not answer. She didn't know what she had done. The cuff, perhaps. The physical symbol was broken, while some strand of the bond still remained, unwilling to accept it was finished, just because a king had said so. Or maybe it wasn't her at all. Maybe him. Some crack finally splitting open, now there wasn't a court watching him hold himself together. The thought settled somewhere difficult within her chest. A sharp, small flicker of satisfaction. Unwelcome. Cruel. Good. Make it sting. Let him feel a tenth of what she'd felt, standing in that circle, waiting for him to look at her like she was real. And just behind that, near enough to rob the satisfaction of its breath, guilt, because some stupid, stubborn 3 years deep part of her still didn't want him to get hurt. No, not this way. The part of herself she hated in that moment. I hated it like you hate a wound that keeps on bleeding, no matter how tight you bind it up. The ache in her chest ebbed slowly, like pain does when it's not yours to bear, leaving only a dull, ringing echo and the strange knowledge that whatever they had really hadn't stopped. Hanged, not cut off. There was a difference, and some treacherous corner of her mind refused to stop turning it over. Nia straightened up, got her breathing under control, forced herself to keep walking. It didn't matter what had happened to Darian, wherever he was. It wasn't her problem anymore. That was what she had told herself on the walk down from the castle, and she believed it again, one careful step at a time. Ahead of her in the dark, something shifted. A sound, like claws, scraping slowly on stone, patient, unhurried, much too close. Whatever was waiting for her down here hadn't announced itself yet. She had a very strong, bone-deep feeling that it was going to. The scream that ripped through the corridor, a heartbeat later, was like nothing Nia had ever heard, and every instinct she owned told her to run. She ran, her boots slapped on stone as she ran deeper into the dark instead of toward the gate. Some animal calculation, faster than thought, deciding whatever was chasing her was between her and the way out. The corridor veered sharply to the left, then suddenly opened into a larger chamber, and Nia threw herself through the opening, just as something pale and shrieking cut through the space she had occupied less than half a second before. She hit the ground hard, rolled, came up against the base of a stone pillar, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it could be heard 3 chambers away. The thing in the corridor did not arrive. Instead it hovered at the threshold, a wraith, she realized distantly, the words surfacing from 100 childhood warnings she'd never quite believed until now. Gray and translucent, its shape like smoke on the wind, flickering, its shriek dying to a low, hungry hiss as it strained against some barrier she couldn't see. "You're safe here." The voice was behind her, calm, layered somehow, as if 2 voices were saying the same words half a beat apart. Nia spun, scrabbling back until her spine struck the pillar. A woman was in the middle of the chamber. Or did not quite stand, and not quite a woman either, though she wore the shape of one, tall and regal in robes of deep silver gray, that did not move like fabric should, but seemed to drift instead like something underwater. Her eyes were without color, just light, pale and steady, fixed on Nia with an ancient attention. "Who?" Nia's voice faltered. She swallowed, again. "Who are you?" A question with a very long answer. The woman tilted her head, looking at Nia as one might look at a puzzle finally fitted with its missing piece. "But you may call me what those before you called me. Sovereign. Though I think that title suits you better now than it ever did me." Nia slowly shook her head. I don't get it." "You will?" The woman drifted closer, and the wraith at the threshold recoiled, snarling low, but retreated further into the dark corridor beyond. "You came through the gate. It opened to you without a key, without a summons, without a drop of blood shed to make it open. Do you know what that means?" "No." The truth spilled out before Nia could stop it. "I don't know what all this means." The woman's pale eyes softened a little into something that almost looked like sympathy. "Spirit walker," she said, and the word was as holy as anything in the quiet room, not like the word curse that had been Nia's shadow since she was 7. "You didn't stumble into this place tonight, child. You were meant to walk it." Nia's breath caught somewhere in her throat, caught between 11 years of hiding and one impossible, terrifying, half-formed hope. "You were always meant to rule it," the woman repeated, softer this time, and held out one translucent hand into the space between them. "Come, I will show you what you are." Nia stared at the hand held out to her for a long moment before she forced herself to take it. It wasn't like touching a person at all. It felt like touching cold water that had somehow learned the shape of fingers, solid enough to grip, but wrong in a way that made the small hairs on her arm rise. Anyway, the sovereign's grip was gentle, and something about that gentleness, after a night spent surrounded by people who'd looked at her like a stain to be scrubbed out, made Nia's throat go tight. "Come with me," the sovereign said, already turning, her robes drifting like smoke around her ankles. "There's a lot you didn't learn, and not much time to teach it right. We'll have to make do. Nia fell into step beside her, glancing one last time back toward the corridor where the wraith had fled. It viewed them from the shadows, hunched and hissing low, but made no move to follow after. It hears you, said Nia. It obeys me. The sovereign's mouth curved, not quite a smile. There is a difference, and you would do well to learn it quickly. The dead in this place do not answer to kindness, child. They answer to blood that carries the old mark. Yours does. That is why the gate opened. That is why the wraith did not touch you, though it very much wanted to. Nia's stomach flipped. The old brand, you mean? Spirit Walker, the sovereign said again, the word resting in the corridor as though it belonged there more than any word Nia had heard spoken about herself in years. A bloodline older than the Silverthorn crown. There was a time when there was always one living who could walk both worlds, who could speak with the dead without losing herself to them, who could command what others could only fear. There hasn't been one in 3 generations. Until me. Nia's voice was not as big as she wanted it to be. Until you. They passed through an archway carved with symbols Nia did not understand, but something in her chest did. A low hum of familiarity, like a song heard once in early childhood, and never quite forgotten. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, lined with alcoves, each containing what at first seemed to be statues. They were not statues. Nia slowed, her breath catching at the sight of the shapes in the stone recesses. Bodies, preserved, dressed in ceremonial furs and armor gone soft with age, crowns still resting on brows that had stopped breathing centuries ago. The entombed alphas, said the sovereign, in a soft voice. All the kings who ruled Silverthorn and died with its crown on are here. They do not sleep easy. Most of them have opinions and very little patience for the living that forget to be respectful. Nia swallowed, her eyes slowly moving down the line of the dead, the line stretching further into the dark than she could see. Why is this place here? She asked. Why cover it up? Why have everyone think it's something to be afraid of? Because fear, the sovereign said, is easier to control than truth. And because for 300 years, there's been no one left who could walk in here and command what waits, without being consumed by it. She turned, pale eyes locking on Nia with an unsettling focus. Up until now. Somewhere in the depths of the chamber, one of the alcoves groaned and creaked, as if stone were shifting, ancient joints stretching. Nia tensed up. They know where you are, said the sovereign, unperturbed. They've been waiting a real long time to meet you. The vault door was smaller than Nia had expected, set into the deepest wall of the chamber, half swallowed by shadow and centuries of dust. And locked it was, too, very unmistakably. There is no key, the sovereign said, watching her pick at the seams of the door. There was never need for one. Only blood. Nia's stomach churned. You want me to bleed this? I want you to touch it. The sovereign's expression didn't change, patient in the way of something that had lived far longer than patience ought to allow. The rest you will know by the mark on your hand. Nia glanced at her own wrist. Nothing there now, just a cuff that had been there 3 years. Nothing to say she belonged to anyone. She hadn't seen the slight discoloration under her skin until tonight. A birthmark, she'd always thought, small enough to cover with a sleeve. In the low, odd light of the chamber, it looked less like a birthmark and more like the ghost of a symbol waiting to awaken. She flattened her palm against the vault door. The brand on her wrist flared, not with pain, but with a heat that spread rapidly up her arm into her chest, quick and startling, like sunlight breaking suddenly through clouds. The ancient joins of the door shone the same pale silver gray as the sovereign's robes, tracing lines through the stone that hadn't been there a moment before. And then, with a groan of stone on stone, it opened. Nia pulled back, breathing fast. Inside, on a pedestal of black stone, sat a throne no bigger than a chair, carved from something that looked like bone and moonlight woven together, its surface etched with the same silver-gray symbols, now glowing faintly across the threshold of the vault. The Veil Throne, said the sovereign, and there was a sort of reverence in her voice, for the first time since Nia had met her. All the thrones of every spirit walker that ever ruled here, dormant ever since the last of your bloodline decided to hide instead of claim it. Nia's whole body froze. I am not, she shook her head and involuntarily took a step backwards. I'm not a queen. I'm nothing. 3 hours ago I was on my knees in a court, being accused of a crime I didn't commit, waiting for my mate to defend me, and getting nothing. I don't know how to rule anything. Nobody does at first. The sovereign approached, robes whispering mute across stone. But power doesn't ask for permission, child, and neither does grief. You've spent your whole life learning to shrink yourself down so the people around you could feel safe. This throne doesn't care how small you've learned to make yourself. It only cares if you're willing, finally, to stop. Mia's eyes stung, sharp and uninvited. She blinked hard in it. And if I touch it, she said softly, there's no taking that back, is there? No, assented the sovereign. There ain't. Mia stared at the throne for a long moment, at the weight of it, the terrible, glowing possibility of it, and thought of a court chamber somewhere far above her, thought of iron doors slamming shut, thought of a man's eyes looking straight through her, like she was already gone. She went forward, and laid her hand upon the veil throne. The entire chamber trembled around her, alive. The light didn't hurt me. That was the first thing Naya saw, a silver-gray brilliance that flowed from under her palm and up her arm, filling the vault, pouring out through the open door into the wider chamber beyond, and none of it burned. Instead, it was like exhaling after holding her breath for 11 years. She heard the wraiths before she saw them, a low rolling murmur that flowed through the corridors like wind through dry leaves, dozens of voices at once, hushed and reverent. When Naya turned away from the throne, 3 of them were at the vault's threshold, pale and huddled, watching her with a prickle-raising intensity. No one attacked them. One was larger than the others, with shoulders hunched with something that could have been armor once, centuries washed away to little more than shadow. It stepped forward alone, pulling away from the rest. Sovereign? It rasped, but the word was not aimed at the woman beside her. No doubt it was aimed at Naya. The sovereign's mouth twisted in something like amusement. This one doubts easily. For 200 years he has doubted every claimant, and rightly so, until tonight. Answer him carefully. Naya's pulse raced. She had no clue what answering carefully was supposed to look like. All she knew was that she stood there, silver light still pulsing under her skin, and the old instinct was rising fast, as familiar as breathing, the one that told her to shrink, to soften her voice, to make herself easier to overlook. She suppressed it. I don't know what you want me to say, she told the wraith, forcing herself to meet its hollow gaze and not lower her eyes, as she'd been taught to do by 3 years of being at Darian's side. I just learned what I am tonight. I've been told this my whole life. She raised her glowing hand slightly. Was something to be ashamed of. I don't have some great speech for you. The wraith didn't stir. But I'm done kneeling for people who have already decided what I am before I've said a word, Naya said, and to her own surprise her voice didn't tremble. So if you have a question, ask it. If you have a challenge, give it. But you will not get silence from me, not anymore. A deep, complete silence settled over the chamber. Then, slowly, deliberately, the wraith folded, not collapsing but bending, an old formal motion that seemed almost like a bow. Lord, it said again, and this time the word was unmistakably reverent. All the breath went out of Naya at once. She looked at the sovereign, half expecting some explanation, some warning that this was only temporary, fragile, easily undone. The sovereign instead bowed her head, her pale eyes gleaming with what looked impossibly like pride. You did not beg, you ordered, she said. That was all. That was all there ever needed to be. Naya looked back down at her own hand, still glowing faintly, still trembling a little, not with fear, she realized, with something altogether different. Something that felt for the first time in more years than she could recall, dangerously close to power. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into something Mia stopped counting. She trained in the great chamber beneath the watchful silver-gray light of the veil throne, learning to call the wraiths without flinching, learning to meet the sovereign's gaze without looking away first, learning, slowly, painfully, one small victory at a time, to stop apologizing for the space she took up in a room. The girl who had knelt in that court chamber, hands folded, voice breaking on pleas, felt further away with each passing day. Sometimes Mia found herself slipping into old habits, the instinct to soften her voice, to make herself smaller, to prepare for someone else's judgment before it's even arrived. And every time she'd make herself stop, stood up a little straighter, forced herself to speak a bit louder. It didn't happen overnight. Nothing of consequence ever did. But there were moments, small, unremarkable moments, when Mia realized the change had already taken root without her fully noticing. She set 3 wraiths through a morning training session, her voice never shaking once. That afternoon she saw her own reflection in the black glass of the vault door and didn't immediately begin to think of all the ways she should apologize for existing within it. The night she fell asleep on the cold stone floor beside the veil throne, not afraid at all of a place that would have once haunted her nightmares. She thought no more of the court above. Mostly. There were still moments, late in whatever passed for night, this far below the earth, when her hand strayed unconsciously to the bare skin of her wrist, looking for a cuff that was no longer there. And still times when the memory of gray eyes staring right through her came up sharp and unwelcome, stealing the breath from her chest before she could stop it. And sometimes she let herself feel it, just for a small time. Then she forced herself to stand, to walk back to the throne room, and to continue becoming who she was supposed to be instead. "You are different," the sovereign spoke one evening, or what had come to be evening to Mia, in a place with no true sun to mark the hours, watching her cross the chamber with a stillness that had once been unimaginable to the girl who'd knelt shaking in a Silverthorn court. "Even your walk is different." "It's good," Mia said simply, and she meant it. The ground trembled on what she calculated to be the 90th day. Not the familiar hum of the veiled throne settling down, not the low drone of wraiths assembling for training. This was different, a deep, strange shudder that ran through the ancient stone from somewhere high above, from the direction of the gate she hadn't touched since the night she'd walked through it. The sovereign went very still, head tilting, pale eyes narrowing on the sound. "Has just walked into the necropolis." Mia's pulse shot up, sharp, an old instinct rising before she could stop it. She didn't need to ask who it was. Part of her already knew, the part that could still feel the precise shape of a bond, snapping cold beneath her ribs. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into something Mia stopped counting. She trained in the great chamber beneath the watchful silver-gray light of the veiled throne, learning to call the wraiths without flinching, learning to meet the sovereign's gaze without looking away first, learning, slowly, painfully, one small victory at a time, to stop apologizing for the space she took up in a room. The girl who had knelt in that court chamber, hands folded, voice breaking on pleas, felt further away with each passing day. Sometimes Mia found herself slipping into old habits, the instinct to soften her voice, to make herself smaller, to prepare for someone else's judgment before it's even arrived. And every time she'd make herself stop, stood up a little straighter, forced herself to speak a bit louder. It didn't happen overnight. Nothing of consequence ever did. But there were moments, small, unremarkable moments, when Mia realized the change had already taken root without her fully noticing. She set 3 wraiths through a morning training session, her voice never shaking once. That afternoon she saw her own reflection in the black glass of the vault door and didn't immediately begin to think of all the ways she should apologize for existing within it. The night she fell asleep on the cold stone floor beside the veil throne, not afraid at all of a place that would have once haunted her nightmares. She thought no more of the court above. Mostly. There were still moments, late in whatever passed for night, this far below the earth, when her hand strayed unconsciously to the bare skin of her wrist, looking for a cuff that was no longer there. And still times when the memory of gray eyes staring right through her came up sharp and unwelcome, stealing the breath from her chest before she could stop it. And sometimes she let herself feel it, just for a small time. Then she forced herself to stand, to walk back to the throne room, and to continue becoming who she was supposed to be instead. "You are different," the sovereign spoke one evening, or what had come to be evening to Mia, in a place with no true sun to mark the hours, watching her cross the chamber with a stillness that had once been unimaginable to the girl who'd knelt shaking in a Silverthorn court. "Even your walk is different." "It's good," Mia said simply, and she meant it. The ground trembled on what she calculated to be the 90th day. Not the familiar hum of the veiled throne settling down, not the low drone of wraiths assembling for training. This was different, a deep, strange shudder that ran through the ancient stone from somewhere high above, from the direction of the gate she hadn't touched since the night she'd walked through it. The sovereign went very still, head tilting, pale eyes narrowing on the sound. "Has just walked into the necropolis." Mia's pulse shot up, sharp, an old instinct rising before she could stop it. She didn't need to ask who it was. Part of her already knew, the part that could still feel the precise shape of a bond, snapping cold beneath her ribs. Mia watched the wraiths strike from the shadowed overlook. And for one suspended, horrible second, She did nothing. It was coming from the ceiling of the corridor, a gray blur shrieking down at Darian faster than his exhausted body could follow. He flung himself sideways at the last possible moment, rolling hard against stone and coming up snarling, already twisting his lips, claws extending along his fingers even as blood ran fresh from the gash on his arm. He fought like a man who had nothing to lose. Recklessness. Rage. Totally devoid of the careful, measured control she had come to expect from 3 years of watching him command a war room. The wraith slammed him across the ribs, and Nia's whole body winced before she could stop it. He fights alone because he deserves nothing else. The Sovereign watched Mia's reaction rather than the battle below. He said quietly, "Strange, isn't it? A king with an army surrounding him, and he decided to come here alone, without a single guard." Mia didn't say anything, her fingers cramped from squeezing the stone ledge so tightly. Darian drove the wraith back viciously beneath, breathing hard, blood slicked and quivering with exhaustion that had nothing to do with the fight, and everything to do with how many sleepless nights had brought him to this state. He staggered, threw himself against the wall, and in the sudden silence after the wraith had retreated into the dark, his voice cracked out into the corridor. Mia. Her name, just her name. Raw. And wrecked. Ringing up through stone that had heard 300 years of dead kings and never once carried a sound like that. Plea, Mia. His voice totally broke on the second word. I know you're here. I can feel you. Even broken, even suspended, I can still feel you. And I need you to know. He didn't quite finish. He just sank down against the wall, one hand flat on his own chest, over where the bond had once sat warm and steady. And Nia realized with a lurch that he was feeling the very same phantom ache she'd felt in this place 90 days ago. The same tearing, borrowed hurt. Dropped, not cut off. She'd known that fact for 90 days. She watched him fold over with it now, and wondered how long he'd known. Something in her chest, something she'd worked very hard to bury under silver light and command, and 90 days of learning not to flinch, cracked audibly. Part of you still wants to go to him, said the Sovereign, not unkindly. You see him suffering. That is not weakness, child. That is simply the truth of a bond that was never fully severed, no matter what words were spoken in that court. Nia felt his throat constrict. I don't want to want that. Wanting and choosing are not the same thing. The Sovereign looked fully at her now, pale eyes steady. These 90 days, you have learned how to command. How to let someone see you, and still remain exactly who you have become. Darian lay below, breathing raggedly, his head still bowed, his hand still pressed to his chest as if he held himself together by sheer force of will. Nia took a slow breath, straightened her back, and stepped out of the shadows. As she stepped into the dim light of the corridor, Darian's head snapped up, and whatever he'd been expecting to see, it certainly wasn't this. Nia watched it in real time, how his eyes went over her, looking for injury, for fear, for the trembling, uncertain woman he had last seen, kneeling in a court chamber, begging him to look at her. He saw nothing of it. Instead, he found her standing tall in robes of silver gray that drifted like smoke around her ankles, the faint glow of the mark of the veil throne still humming beneath the skin of her wrist, 3 wraiths trailing a half-step behind her, silent and obedient. Mia. Her name again, but different this time, less broken, more disbelieving, like a man trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same person, and failing. Darian. Her voice was level, controlled, the voice of a man who could command a room full of the dead without lifting it. You don't belong here. I had to. He pushed himself away from the wall and swayed a little and caught himself before she had to decide whether or not she would have moved to steady him. I had to find you. The bond. It's not Mia. It's not gone. I feel you all the time. I feel everything, and I don't know how, because I was the one who said the words. I was the one who suspended it, she finished for him, flat. Yes, I know exactly what it sounded like. He flinched, and for one unprotected second, she saw the man she used to know underneath all that blood and exhaustion, the man who used to fumble a cuff's clasp and laugh at himself in the dark. I was wrong, he said softly. I don't really understand why I did what I did that night. It doesn't feel like it was really mine, the coldness, the way I just stopped seeing you. But I know that's not an excuse. I know what it cost you. Mia's chest hurt at that, sharp and unwanted. but she held her ground. "You didn't just stop coming to see me," she said. "You let an entire court judge what I was before I'd said a word in my own defense. And now Seraphine sits pretty on a throne you abandoned to come chase me through a place that would have killed most wolves in less than an hour." The name Seraphine made something flicker in his face. Not guilt exactly. Recognition, perhaps, like some missing piece had just clicked halfway into place. "She's regent?" He clenched his jaw. "Already?" "Already." Mia tipped her chin up. "Your laws don't apply here, Darian. I no longer wait for kings to decide my fate. I write my own rules now." The words settled in the silent hallway with a gravity she felt in her bones, a purposeful, precise reflection of the same cold, hard authority with which she had once ended her entire world in a single sentence. Darian stared at her a long moment, something raw and complicated moving behind his slate-gray eyes. Not rage, not even surprise, not really, something closer to wonder. He said softly. "No," Mia said. "I am not." He reached for something at his belt and winced as the movement pulled at the gash along his ribs, and Naya's hand went up instinctively. Not to help him, she told herself, just to be ready for whatever came next. Then came a scrap of black cloth, torn and soiled, and wrapped about something small enough to lie in the palm of his hand. "I took this from under the floor of the throne room," Darian said quietly. "The night of your trial, after you left. I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong that night felt, how wrong I felt, so I went looking for answers instead of sleep." He offered it to her. Naya hesitated only a moment before accepting it, unwrapping the cloth with careful fingers. The fragment inside caught the faint light from the corridor, and her spirit walker vision jumped unexpectedly, the world around her sharpening, becoming layered and doubled, the way it had started to over the last 90 days, whenever something brushed the boundary between the living world and the dead. The fragment was symbolic, black-veined and jagged where the false binding mark of her trial had been rigid and clean, but related, unmistakably related, drawn by the same careless, hungry hand. Her breath hitched. "This isn't mine," she said, slowly, "and neither is it yours. This is no wolfcraft at all, Darian. I know." His voice was very soft now. "I knew it when I found it, like something old and hungry and—" He stopped, jaw working, "and so familiar, like it had been with me a long time and I never saw." Naya flipped the fragment over, and the sigil throbbed once beneath her fingers, a slow, deliberate throb, perfectly in time. She felt a chill run up her spine, with the beat of Darian's own heart. Her eyes flew to his. "You're marked," she breathed. Marked by what? Thus far she had no answer, but with a sudden vertiginous clarity, she knew that the cold, unreadable man who had looked right through her in that court chamber, who had let a court destroy her over a forged sigil startlingly like this one, might never have been fully himself at all. It did not erase what he had done. She was nowhere near ready to let it erase what he'd done, but it shattered something in the neat, assured story she'd been telling herself for 90 days. Her story of him as merely cruel, merely weak, merely a man who would choose a crown over her. "Something's in you," she said slowly. "Something old. And I think it's been there longer than one night in a courtroom." Darian's face was pale beneath the blood and exhaustion. "Then help me find it," he said. "Please. Not for the crown. Not for me." His eyes met hers, steady in spite of everything. "Let me know what it cost you that night, so I don't let it happen again." The sigil pulsed again on her palm, hungry and patient, and somewhere deep in her chest, the bond she had thought fully suspended gave one slow answering beat of its own. Mia stood in the corridor a long time after the sigil's pulse finally went still in her palm, turning the fragment over and over between her fingers, while Darian watched her with an exhaustion that had gone beyond physical. The old instinct was still there, whispering underneath everything else, "Retreat. Go back to the throne chamber. Let the sovereign wrap this place around her like armor, and leave the mess above ground to sort itself out without her." 90 days ago, she might have listened to it. She didn't listen to it now. "I'm not doing this for you," she said finally, wrapping the black cloth back around the sigil with careful hands. "I want that understood before we go any further." Understood. Darian didn't argue. He simply watched her, wary and hopeful in a way that made something in her chest twist. "I'm doing this because whatever is inside you didn't stay contained to one bad night in a courtroom," Mia continued. "It's been feeding off something for a long time, and I have a feeling it isn't finished. If it's touched you, It's touched the pack. And the pack, she paused, surprised by her own certainty. The pack isn't yours to protect alone anymore. It's mine too, whether the court wants to admit that or not. Something shifted in Darian's expression, not relief exactly, more like being seen for the first time in a while than he might admit. Then let me help, said he. Anything you need, tracking it, fighting it, standing in front of it if it comes to that. I don't want you fighting for me. Mia's voice snapped, old anger rising fast and hot. I needed that 3 years ago in a room full of people defining what I was. You didn't stand up for me then. The words hit with all the force she intended. Darian did not look away, and this surprised her more than if he had. I know, he said softly. I know, and I don't have anything to say that makes that night less good than it was. Mia looked at him for a long moment. Blood dried along his forearm, exhaustion carved deep beneath his eyes. Not a trace of the polished, unreadable king who had stood on that dais and destroyed her with a single sentence. Finally she said, I need you honest, beginning now, not the careful, controlled version you give a court. Everything. Whatever this thing is, whatever it's done to you, whatever it's made you do, I want the truth, even when it's ugly, especially then. Yes, he said it immediately, without hesitation, in a voice that was almost a plea for the opportunity. Mia turned the wrapped sigil over again in her hand, and felt its faint, patient hum even through the cloth. Then we see what this is, she said, and how long it's been wearing you without one of us noticing. The sovereign hovered somewhere behind her, silent at the corridor's edge, giving her the space to make this choice on her own. Mia was more grateful for that than she could say. She looked back at Darian, the man who had once been her whole world, the man who had once let that world burn. Come walk with me, she said. Let's see what has been after both of us. They didn't get far before Darian's legs finally gave way. Naya caught his arm, instinctively, not tenderly, not with the tenderness of a lover, but with the practical grip of one who did not want a wounded man to crack his skull on stone. He leaned against the corridor wall, breathing hard. Blood loss and exhaustion caught up with 3 years of careful control, unraveling all at once. Sit. It was more a command than a request, and he sat. She knelt down before him, examining the cut along his ribs with clinical intensity, not letting herself think about how close her hands were to his skin, how the old, familiar warmth of him still tugged at something beneath her ribs, no matter how hard she'd worked these 90 days to bury it. This wants binding, she muttered, tearing a strip from the hem of her own robe, not waiting to be told. Naya. His voice when he spoke had dropped into something rawer than she'd yet heard from him. Not the wrecked desperation of the corridor, but something quieter. Something that sounded like a confession at last, came out, having been held in too long. I have to say something, and I need you to let me say all of it before you decide what to do with it. She kept her hands steady, wrapped the cloth around his ribs, and said nothing, which he seemed to take as permission enough. I allowed you to kneel in that room, he said. I watched them tear you apart, and some part of me, the part I want to believe wasn't entirely mine, whispered that it was easier. Easier to let the court believe what it wanted than to fight a room full of nobles who had already made up their minds. I told myself I was protecting the crown, protecting stability. His jaw clenched. It was pride. Just pride, the excuse of wearing a crown. Whatever that sigil did to sharpen it, to twist it, the pride itself was always mine. I will not hide behind the parasite to excuse the man. Naya's hands went still on his ribs. I chose a crown of cold steel over your truth, he continued, his voice breaking on the last word. And I have felt that choice like a blade in my chest every single hour since you disappeared through that gate. I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I am asking anyway, because I don't know how to survive not asking. He moved, and before she could intervene, he fell off the edge entirely, and down to his knees on the cold stone floor before her. Not a king kneeling for the show, but a man kneeling because he truly had nothing left to give. I don't want the mate bond back on the old terms, he said. I don't want obedience, or a wife who kneels because a law says she should. I ask for the honor of courting you, as an equal, on whatever terms you decide, for however long it takes, even if that's never. I would rather spend the rest of my life earning something I don't deserve than spend another day pretending I was ever worthy of what I already had. Naya sat back on her heels, her throat tight, the strip of fabric forgotten between her fingers. She desperately wanted to forgive him, right then. That old, wounded, still loving part of her wanted it so badly it hurt. She made herself wait, though. "I hear you," she said at last, quiet, even. "That doesn't mean I trust you." "I know." His eyes found hers, steady against the blood and the exhaustion and the raw hope he was no longer trying to hide. "I'm not asking for your trust today. I'm asking for the opportunity to earn it." She got to her feet and reached a hand toward him, not tenderness, she told herself, just practicality, and he took it. "Then win it," she said, "starting with helping me find what's inside you." The sigil took them deeper into the necropolis than Nya had ever been alone, beyond the chamber of the entombed alphas, and into a narrow passage she hadn't known existed, until the fragment in her hand began to pulse, harder, faster, hungrier with each step. "Do you feel that?" Darian asked softly, one hand pressed flat against his own breastbone. "I feel it pulling towards something," Nya said. "Not away from you, toward you, as if it's trying to go home." The passage opened into a chamber unlike anything she had seen, the walls scored with the same black-veined sigils, dozens of them, layered one upon the other, in a way that suggested decades, perhaps centuries of use. In the middle was a cracked stone altar, old and forsaken, dark with age in a way Nya didn't want to examine too closely. "This has been here a long time," she murmured. "Longer than me," Darian said, voice tight. "I should say more than my father, from the look of it." Nya moved slowly forward towards the altar, her spirit walker sight sharpening as she stood in the chamber. Layers of the room peeling away to reveal something older and darker below the visible stone. A thing, old, patient. She knew of her the moment she knew of herself, and with a shiver, she knew. Spirit walker. It wasn't Darian's voice. It poured in from all directions, low and layered, sliding through the chamber like oil on water. Darian beside her went rigid, his eyes losing focus for one horrifying second, before snapping back, sharper, harder, entirely wrong. "You shouldn't have come looking," the voice said again, this time coming out of Darian's mouth, but the cadence underneath was nothing like his own. "I've worn this bloodline longer than your little sanctuary's been around, little sovereign. Kings do such useful things when their pride's well fed." Nya felt her blood turn cold. "Who are you?" "Mordrath." The name sat in the room like something ancient, claiming its territory. "And you, Spirit Walker, are going to become very interesting indeed." Darian shivered all over. When he saw again, it was his own, large and horrified, gulping like a man breaking the surface of deep water. "Nya," his voice broke. "Get back. Whatever that was, it's still here. It's still—" "I know." She didn't move. Fear crawled up her spine, but underneath it something colder and steadier held firm. The same voice that had commanded a wraith to bow 90 days ago. "It's been feeding on your pride for generations. Every king who let cruelty win over truth. Every choice you made in that courtroom. It wasn't just influence. It was being fed." Darian's face turned pale. "Trial, Seraphine, everything. Not innocent," Nya said softly, stopping him before hope could soften what had to stay sharp. "You made that choice, but for a very long time, something's been sharpening every worst instinct you've ever had." The sigils of the chamber, black-veined, pulsed together once, a slow and hungry heartbeat. "We need a way to cut it out," said Nya. "Sure, don't suppress it, don't block it." Her eyes met Darian's, calm and sure. They left the sigil chamber with more questions than answers, but one thing was abundantly clear by the time they climbed back toward the Necropolis gate. Whatever Mordrath was, it wanted them both back above ground, back within the court's reach, back somewhere it could finish whatever it had begun. "It uses Seraphine," Nya said, working it out loud as they walked. "It has to be. She moved too fast, too cleanly, the minute you were gone. That's not just ambition, that's help." Darian's jaw clenched. "Then we go back. We return," Nya agreed, "but not as the ones who left." She saw herself in a slick of black water pooled along the corridor floor, silver-gray robes, the faint glow still humming beneath her wrist. A stillness in her own eyes that hadn't been there the last time she'd walked this path in the other direction. 90 days had made her a woman the Silverthorn court had never known. "They'll be looking for the girl who knelt," she said quietly, "the one that begged for attention and got ignored." "They won't get her," Darian said. and now there was something fierce in his voice, something that sounded, for the first time, like a man fighting for her, instead of just fighting with her. They'll get who you are instead, and I'm going to be behind that, not in front of it. Naya looked at him, surprised at the change. No crown posture, no instinct to lead, just a quiet willingness to follow her lead for once, into a fight that was as much hers now as it had ever been his. They reached the gate, and the sovereign appeared silently next to them, robes drifting in the air, pale eyes darting between the two of them, with an appraisal Naya couldn't quite read. "Go back, you mean," said the sovereign. "Wasn't a matter of." "We're going to have to," Naya said. "Whatever is going on up there, it's related to whatever's going on down here. I can't fight it from inside these walls forever." The sovereign looked at her for a long moment, and something in her ancient layered expression softened, not quite a smile, but something close. "They will not know you," she said. "Let them fear that, if fear is what they need to finally see clearly." She paused, pale eyes flickering briefly to Darian, before returning to Naya. "You can call the dead here wherever you are, living world or no. You will not walk back into that court alone, sovereign. Not again." That, the weight of finally having something solid behind her, after so long standing in rooms that offered her nothing but judgment, squeezed Naya's throat. "Thank you," she said softly. The gate creaked open for her, the hinges giving way as they had 90 days ago. Only this time, it felt less like an ending, and more like a threshold she was choosing to cross, on her own terms. Darian fell in just behind her shoulder, not leading, not trailing, as the cold night air of the world above washed over them both for the first time in 3 months. Beyond the tree line, somewhere, the lights of the Silverthorn court still burned, unaware of what was about to walk back through its doors. Naya squared her shoulders and pushed forward. She was finished with invisibility. The Silverthorn court chamber was as it had been the night she'd left it. The same silks, the same candlelight, the same 12 pairs of eyes arranged in a familiar circle. This time Mia walked through the iron doors without a flinch. The doors didn't bang. They need not have been. The conversation in the room stopped as soon as she stepped through the door, a silence that spread like a stone thrown into still water. She knew the reason. Last time this court saw her, she was down on her knees, hands together, voice cracking on pleas. Now she stepped inside, clad in silver gray flowing like smoke around her ankles, the mark of the veil throne shining faint and steady under the skin of her bare wrist, 3 wraiths trailing silently behind her, like a shadow given form. Nobody in that circle needed to be told what she'd become. They could feel it, like animals can feel a storm before the sky shifts. Lady Seraphine was standing by the dais, and for one moment, just one moment, she cracked. Her eyes went wide, her hand paused in the act of smoothing her sleeve, and something that looked suspiciously like fear flickered behind the carefully composed mask, before she smoothed that away too. "Nia," Seraphine's quick recovery snapped back with a voice pitched to the room. "How lovely. We were afraid after you." "Gone," Nia finished for her, strolling leisurely across the chamber floor. "Vanished into a place where most wolves die in an hour." "Yes, I guess that suited you very well." The assembled nobles murmured together. Nia let it sink in before she went on, enjoying just a little the particular pleasure of being listened to instead of brushed off. "I hear there are congratulations in order," she said. Her tone was light, almost pleasant, and that made the words hit harder than if she'd shouted them. "Regent, that's quite a feat, especially with how quickly you got it organized." The king wasn't present. Seraphine lifted her chin. Somebody had to keep the pack together. Of course. Nia let her eyes wander slowly around the room, over faces that had watched her humiliation 3 months ago without a single objection, now watching her with a very different kind of attention. Much easier to keep a pack together once you've removed anyone loyal enough to ask inconvenient questions. "I heard about the council. Very efficient work, Seraphine, truly." Seraphine's lips tightened. "I don't get what you're saying." "I'm not implying anything." Nia stopped a few feet away, within reach now to see the fine tremor in Seraphine's clasped hands, the first honest thing she'd shown all evening. "Just watching. You climbed mighty high for a girl who said she was just trying to help." She heard Darian enter the chamber behind her. No crown posture, no announcement, just there, just as he'd promised in the corridor below. Seraphine's eyes flicked past Nia to him, and something calculating, quick and sharp, moved behind her expression. "My king," she said, bowing, but not to her eyes. "You look ill. Maybe the Necropolis was not kind to you." "I'm better than I've been in months," Darian said quietly, and Nia felt something warm settle briefly beneath her ribs at the certainty in his voice. "Get down, Seraphine. The regency is over tonight." Seraphine's calm held for one more heartbeat. Then it cracked. Unmistakably, the crack runs fast. Seraphine's carefully composed face twisted in something Nia had never seen before. Not anger, not even fear, but some kind of hungry, unraveling desperation, the mask of gracious regent falling away all at once to reveal something far uglier underneath. "Stand down." The laugh that came from Seraphine was harsh, humorless. "Quit and give it all back to a king who abandoned his own throne for a woman half the court thinks is cursed? You don't know what I've built these last 3 months. You don't know what it cost me." "Then tell us." Nia's voice was even, but every instinct in her body had gone taut, sensing the shift in the room before she fully understood its shape. Seraphine's eyes flicked to her, and something in them had gone completely cold. "Do you want to know who made that binding mark?" she said. Her voice dropped low enough that the whole chamber leaned in to hear. "You want to know why the Eastern Watchtower was chosen? Why the timing was so exact? Why a court of fools was so easily manipulated?" "Seraphine," Darian's voice was a low, dangerous threat now. "I did." Seraphine's voice was flat, but there was something in the words that had the weight of a confession long overdue. "Because I was promised something worth far more than a seat at your council table. A crown of my own, when your bloodline finally finished rotting from the inside. All I had to do was help it along." Nia's blood turned cold. "Mordrath." Seraphine's smile became a razor-thin line. "Ah, so you've met him. Good. Saves me the trouble of introductions." The chamber erupted in murmurs, nobles turning to each other in confusion and dawning horror. But Nia registered almost none of it. Her attention narrowed to only Seraphine, to the black-veined glint Nia saw suddenly beneath her skin when she sharpened her spirit walker sight. A mark, faint but undeniable, twisting along the woman's collarbone. "He's been feeding you power," Nia said slowly, "in exchange for feeding him information. For years. Long before you ever showed up at this court." Seraphine agreed. There was something almost gleeful in the admission now. Some pressure valve finally popped after years of careful restraint, long enough to know how easy it would be to make you disappear. She raised a hand, and the mark of black veins along her collarbone flared with a bright, ugly light that spilled out into the chamber. The wraiths behind Nia stiffened, hissing softly. "You should have stayed in your little sanctuary, Spirit Walker," Seraphine said, her voice dropping into something layered and wrong, Mordrath's cadence bleeding through her own unmistakably. "The dead you command are no match for what I've spent years to cultivate." Nia barely had time to shout a warning before the shadows of the chamber itself seemed to peel away from the walls, coalescing into forms far larger and hungrier than the wraiths trailing loyally behind her. The court exploded into screaming chaos, nobles scrambling for the doors as the first bound shadow wraith lunged forward. And Nia realized with a lurch of horror that Seraphine had turned the very dead Nia had learned to command into a weapon pointed squarely at everyone in this room. The shadow wraith tore through the space where Nia had just been standing, and she threw herself sideways, feeling the deep gouge it left in the marble floor, but not in her skin. The chamber had erupted into chaos, nobles shrieking, rushing for the doors, the air thick with the sour, ashen scent of the deepest recesses of the Necropolis, now released within the very heart of Silverthorn's court. Her own wraiths snarled back that they were outnumbered, and there was no sign of Seraphine's borrowed power thinning out. "Darian," Nia's voice ripped from her throat, raw and desperate, searching for him through the smoke and shadow. She saw him a moment later, and her whole body turned cold. He was not fighting the shadow wraiths. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the chaos, spine stiff, eyes all black from edge to edge, and when he turned to her, the move lacked all his own familiar grace. It was taken. Nope, the movement of a puppet, led by something old and patient, that finally decided to do something besides whisper. "Little sovereign." His mouth formed the words, but the voice that spilled out of it was layered, cavernous, nothing like the man who had knelt before her only hours ago. "You opened something in him, ripped at old wounds. Curiosity is a dangerous thing to give a starving god." Nia's hands were shaking. "Darian, fight it. I know you're still in there." "Fighting is tiring," Mordrath said, wearing Darian's voice like a stolen coat. "Pride is such good fuel. 3 years of holding it so carefully, and it only took one perfect night to finally let it out." Darian's, Mordrath's hand came up, and black-veined power snapped along his fingers, and Nia saw with a sudden sickening clarity that whatever was coming was not going to be gentle. She could make it stop. The power of the Veil Throne buzzed inside her, vast, ready, more than able to meet this threat head-on. She understood, too, just as clearly that releasing all of it here, now, aimed at a body that Darian still inhabited, offered no promise that the man beneath would survive it. Her hands remained at her sides, paralyzed by a fear much older than tonight. The same fear that had plagued her since she was 7 years old, reaching for her mother's ghost, and being told, in no uncertain terms, that her power only ever brought ruin. Maybe they were right, whispered a small, wounded voice inside her. Maybe this is how your power was always supposed to be, something that kills the ones you love the most, one way or another. Nia. Darian's voice, suddenly, violently, cut through Mordreth's cadence like a blade through fog. His black eyes flickered, for a heartbeat, back to familiar slate gray, wide with horror at his own hands. Don't! His jaw clenched, visibly straining against whatever held him. Save me, not the king. Before he could say anything else, black swam into his eyes again. Nia stood frozen amidst the wreckage of the court, power quivering beneath her skin, unused, terrified as she had not been since she knelt as a child at a grave, reaching for someone she loved, and being punished for it. The shadow wraiths surged forward at the slightest hesitation on Nia's part. And hesitation, she found out too late, was a luxury this battle had no patience for. One of her own wraiths hurled itself between her and a lunge, shattered to nothing with a shriek that echoed through the ruined chamber. She stumbled back, its absence hitting her harder than she expected, a tiny, sharp grief threading through the bigger terror eating up everything else. Fall back. The Sovereign's voice cut through the din, appearing beside Nia as a swirl of silver gray, pale eyes darted over the wreckage, with an urgency Nia had never heard from her before. You can't win tonight, child, not divided, not while he's still fighting it from inside. I can't just leave him, Nia's voice cracked, watching Darian's borrowed body move through the smoke, black-veined power still sparking along his fingers. You are not leaving him, the Sovereign said sharply. You're living to fight for him, right? Not dying here useless tonight. She snatched Nia's arm, fingers tight, unmoving. Decide, now. Around them the last of the court's nobles fled screaming through side passages as the grand chamber that had once condemned her collapsed into ruin and fire. In the chaos, Seraphine had disappeared, her borrowed power apparently enough to provide her an escape route that Nia hadn't taken. Darian's black eyes met Nia's across the wreckage, and for one last agonizing second, something human flickered there, pleading, desperate, already half resigned to what was coming next. Then Mordreth's voice came out again, low and pleased. Run, little Sovereign. That only makes the reckoning all the sweeter. Nia let the Sovereign pull her down a side passage, half stumbling, her breast heaving with grief and fury, and a fear she had not permitted herself to feel so fully in 90 days of careful control. They didn't stop until they had gained real distance from the burning wreckage of the court chamber, emerging into the cold night air outside the castle walls, smoke curling into the sky behind them, where the Silverthorn court still burned. Nia dropped to her knees in the dirt, her hands shaking, the power of the Veil Throne silent and useless beneath skin that had failed, in the one moment that mattered most, to do anything at all. I couldn't, she whispered. I could have stopped it and I froze. I froze and I stood there, just like I did when I was 7 years old. Just like every single time that I've ever been told what I am is dangerous. You were afraid you'd become what hurt you, the Sovereign said softly, kneeling beside her in the ash-streaked dirt. That is not failure, child. That is only the wound you have not yet finished healing. Nia pressed her palms to her eyes. No matter how tightly she shut them out, the image of Darian's black, unrecognizable stare burned behind them. Tired voice whispered again. Maybe it's easier to be owned only by the dead. They never asked me to have the courage to lose them. The Sovereign's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than Nia had ever heard it. You were never meant to choose between the two worlds, she said. You were born to hold both. But first, child, you must conquer your fear of the cost of holding them. Nia knelt in ash-stained dirt, long after the Sovereign's words had fallen into the silence between them, watching smoke rise up from the wrecked court chamber against a sky just beginning to pale toward dawn. She thought of the 7-year-old girl reaching for her mother's ghost, the aunt's scream, the whispered word cursed that trailed her through every year after. 90 days of learning to command and not to plead, only to freeze in that one moment that mattered most, just as that same terrified child had once done. You need to stop being afraid of the cost of holding them. Something inside her chest moved, slow and deliberate, like a bone settling after a long break. Her entire life she had treated her power like a door that she slammed shut every time it opened too far, keeping it from her aunt, hiding it from Darian. Even here, even after the veil thrown, even after bending wraiths to her will, some small, wounded part of her was still bracing a hand against that door, ready to slam it the instant her power began to look too much like the monster she'd been told she was. That was what had paralyzed her tonight. Not failure, fear of her own strength, still, after all. Nia got to her feet. "I'm finished," she whispered, and the words felt like they cut her to the marrow. "I'm done treating this like something I only take out when I've run out of other options. It's not a last resort. It's not a curse I manage carefully enough to keep from hurting anyone." She turned to face the Sovereign squarely, spine straight, jaw set. "All of it, and I'm done being afraid of what that means. It's mine." The Sovereign studied her for a long moment. Something inscrutable stirred behind the pale ancient eyes. "Say it again," she said gently, "and mean it all the way down. I am a spirit walker." Nia's voice was calm. "I hold the dead and the living, and I will not apologize for it. To a court, to a parasite wearing my mate's face, to the frightened 7-year-old still living somewhere underneath my ribs. Not anymore." The air of the early morning around her appeared to respond to her, a low thrum rising from the earth itself, and Nia felt it before she knew it. The power of the veil throne, no longer limited by the stone walls of the Necropolis, questing for her, even here, even under the open sky. Figures started to assemble at the tree line. Wraiths, dozens of them, were clawing up from the depths of the Necropolis, without her having named them at all. Just responding to the shift in her, the way iron filings respond to a magnet finally allowed to hum at full strength. "They feel it," the Sovereign said, wonder leaking quietly through her ancient voice. No dead had answered a spirit walker outside these walls before, not in 300 years. Nia looked out at the gathering shapes, at an army she had not asked for, given freely, the moment she finally ceased to be afraid of her own reflection. "Good," she said, "because we're going to need them." They gathered what remained of the loyal court beneath the paling sky. A handful of nobles who had fled the chamber rather than back Seraphine. A handful of Darian's most trusted guards. The Sovereign at Nia's side, and behind them all, the silent, patient ranks of the Necropolis dead. "We can't just steamroll Mordrath," Nia said, pacing a tight line in front of the assembled group, her mind moving faster than her feet. "It's been fed on pride and cruelty for generations. It's patient. It's old. If we come at it with force alone, it'll just go deeper into him and wait us out." "Then what?" The older guard, the one with the scar down his cheek, spoke with the wariness of a man who had seen her walk through those iron doors, and who had decided on instinct to believe in whatever she had become. "What wouldst thou have me do, my Sovereign?" The title still sounded odd, still foreign, but not so odd as it had been 3 months ago. "We don't just stop it," Nia said. "Suppression is what kept it alive this long, buried, contained, waiting for the next weak moment to feed on. We cut it entirely, root and all." "Can that be?" asked a noblewoman, her voice thick with doubt. "I don't know," Nia admitted, "but I know it will take 2 things Mordrath doesn't see coming. My power when it's at full strength, flowing through the bond, straight into wherever it's rooted in his bloodline." She looked to the Sovereign. "And a moment when Darian himself fights back hard enough from within to weaken its grip long enough for me to find the root." "Something he has already demonstrated he can make," the Sovereign said softly. "He said your name in that courtroom. He did for a little while. That door's not closed." Nia nodded, her voice even as her stomach churned with what she was going to ask him, wherever he was now. "We've got to get him out in the open, somewhere where I can get at him without a whole court between us." "Seraphine will bring it to you," the scarred guard said grimly. "She's been 3 months getting ready for this. She won't be long finishing it." "Then we don't wait on her timing," Nia said. "We use it. Let her think she's still got all the advantages. Let Mordrath think I froze once and will freeze again." Her jaw was set, something cold and sure settling into her eyes. And when they've both convinced themselves I'm still that scared girl on her knees in the dirt. You prove them wrong, finished the Sovereign. I prove them wrong. I know, Naya said. She glanced at the rows of silent wraiths at the tree line, the weight of command settling on her shoulders like something finally owned instead of borrowed. And Naya took one breath to steady herself before turning back to the small group of the exhausted who remained. We finished this today, she said. The whole lot. She didn't have long to wait for it. It was just after noon when the wraith gave its warning. Seraphine had surfaced in the old training yards, Darian's possessed body beside her, neither of them apparently willing to wait any longer for whatever final move they had been building toward. Naya came to the yard and found it just as she remembered from the night she shattered her betrothal cuff on its stones. Except now Seraphine was standing in the center, black-veined power crawling visibly along her collarbone, Darian a rigid, black-eyed shadow of himself beside her. You came, Seraphine called, something manic threading through her voice now, the careful court composure long since lost. Good. I was beginning to think you'd learn to run, not fight. I don't run anymore, Naya said. Coming into the yard, the Sovereign and a handful of guards spreading out behind her in silence, wraiths gathering unseen at the tree line past. Seraphine's smile turned brittle. We'll see. She lifted her hand and outshot a black-veined power, directed not at Naya but at the little knot of guards surrounding her, a killing blow, quick and without mercy, intended to take out anyone stupid enough to stand next to Naya. Naya stepped forward to intercept, power building fast beneath her skin, but she wasn't close enough, not fast enough, and one horrible second she knew she was about to watch someone die for standing next to her. Darian made the first move. With a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a body Mordrath supposedly controlled, he threw himself between Seraphine's strike and the guards, black eyes flickering violently back to slate gray the same moment the strike hit him full in the chest instead of its intended targets. He didn't make a sound, he just tripped and fell, and dark blood was already soaking his shirt, the black veins under his skin flickering and dying like a fire that had suddenly run out of air. No, Naya's voice broke free from her, ragged and sudden, all her precise commands splintering all at once. Darian, she hadn't even decided to move until she was already there, kneeling in the dirt beside him, hands hovering above the wound, above blood that was spreading far too fast. His own eyes, glassy but unmistakably his, met hers. See, he rasped, the ghost of something almost like a smile at the corners of his mouth despite the blood on his lips. Not for the crown. Don't you dare, Naya said, her voice breaking completely now, all the careful sovereign composure she'd built these past 3 months burning away in an instant, to leave only a woman terrified of losing the man she'd never fully stopped loving. Don't you dare do this and then die on me. Seraphine's victory expression faltered, however, when the blow that should have fallen on another instead struck the very ship her master needed to be whole. Something in the black veins along Darian's skin flickered wildly, weakened, struggling against whatever hold it still had. Naya felt it, the precise moment Mordrath's grip slipped, just a little, fear and love tearing it apart from the inside, in a way 3 months of careful power never quite had. This was his window. Then, all at once, she got it, devastatingly. It would not come back. Darian's breaths were shallow and wet under her hands, the black veins on his skin flickering weaker with every passing second, and Naya knew with brutal clarity that she had perhaps a single heartbeat to choose. Run, save herself, and let the rest of him fall to pieces in the dirt of a training yard he'd once laughed in, clumsy and young and unafraid. Or unleash all that she was, everything without tight control, without half-measures born of old fear, and hope that she was strong enough to hold both his dying body and Mordrath's ancient hungry root at once. Naya. The Sovereign's voice came to her from very far away, urgent, steady. Now, it will not weaken again. Seraphine lunged forward, gathering black-veined power for another blow, screaming something that Naya no longer had the attention to hear. Naya pressed both hands flat against Darian's chest, over the wound, over the place where a bond had pulsed warm and steady between them, before a single cold word had tried to sever it. I'm not choosing between you and what I am anymore, she whispered, more to herself than to him, but his glassy eyes seemed to hear it anyway. I shouldn't have had to. She parted the veil. Power was pouring out of her as it never had before, not the careful, measured command she had practiced for 3 months in the safety of stone corridors, but everything, all of it. silver gray light pouring from beneath her palms and surging through the bond that had never actually been broken, only suspended, only waiting for her to finally stop being afraid to reach through it with full strength. She felt Mordrath the second her power crossed the line into Darian's blood. Ancient, ravenous, twisted deep within a root that had been growing through generations of Silverthorn kings long before either of them had been born. It shrieked, layered and furious into the space behind her eyes, and recoiled, lashing out with claws of borrowed pride and centuries of feeding. It was powerful, ancient, patient. Now she was not afraid of it. Let him go. When Naya let it out, her voice contained every drop of command she'd learned, bowing wraiths and commanding the dead, every drop of grief and fury and love she'd spent a lifetime burying under careful stillness. You are not of this bloodline. You were never more than a parasite in a crown you never earned. Seraphine's second blow never landed. The sovereign took it, wraiths finally spilling from the tree line, meeting Seraphine's borrowed power in a tangle of shadow and silver light. Naya could no longer afford to watch. Her entire attention went to the wellspring of black-veined power under her hands, ancient and furious, and for the first time in 300 years, truly afraid. Naya's grip tightened, the power shone brighter, and finally she started to pull. The root was not willing to give up. Naya could feel it wrestling her with all it had left. Centuries of borrowed pride, generations of fed cruelty, all wound tight at the base of Darian's bloodline, like something that had long since forgotten it was ever a guest rather than an owner. It scratched at the fringes of her power, hissing promises and threats in a voice that overlaid itself, trying every approach it had successfully tried for 300 years. Nothing was working. No more. You don't get to keep him, Naya said, teeth gritted, the silver gray light blazing brighter beneath her palms, pouring through the bond that had never truly broken, no matter how many cold words had tried to sever it. You don't get to keep none of them. She thought of her mother's ghost, soft and drenched in rain no one else could see. She remembered a girl of 7 who told her that her gift was a curse because she loved someone who had died. She thought of all the years of shrinking, of herself, so that others could be safe from what she was. She was finished with shrinking herself. For once she felt the full force of the veil throne rushing through her, not cautious, not measured, not restrained by any lingering fear of what she might become if she let it all the way out. It poured through the bond and found Mordrath's root, where it had burrowed deep into generations of Silverthorn blood, and Naya closed both hands around it the way she once had closed her fist around a shattered betrothal cuff, and she tore. The scream that tore out of the training yard, it wasn't Darian's. It was part of something ancient, finally pulled apart after 300 years of feeding, and the black veins under his skin flashed once, brightly violent, then went dark forever. One of them, Seraphine, shrieked across the yard, her borrowed power guttering out the instant the source was severed, the black mark along her collarbone withering to nothing, leaving her suddenly entirely mortal, stumbling as the wraiths surrounding her closed in without mercy. She never got up again. Naya hardly noticed any of it. Her world narrowed to the man beneath her hands, to the ragged shallow breath finally catching, deepening, steadying beneath her palms. Darian opened his eyes, slate gray, all of him, nothing but him, no black veins, no anything that was not just him, tired, bleeding, looking up at her as if she was the only solid thing left in the world. Naya. Her name, whole and unsplit, no longer split between two rival voices. I am here. Her voice broke. Under her palms, the last of Mordrath's severed root melted into nothing, the silver gray light finally dulling. I'm here. It's over. It's really over. His hand moved up, weak but sure, to cover hers where it still lay on his chest. You did it, he whispered. We did it, she corrected, and finally let herself collapse against him. 3 months and a lifetime of careful distance, finally giving way to something neither of them had to guard against anymore. Word passed through the Silverthorn court more swiftly than Naya could have imagined, swifter than the wraiths who bore it. By the time she'd gotten Darian to his feet, supporting half his weight as they slowly made their way back to the castle, the surviving nobles had already collected at the gates of the courtyard, the same nobles, Naya realized with strange, distant clarity, who had once stood in a circle watching her kneel and offering her nothing. They didn't look at her the same way anymore. News had spread of Seraphine's confession, of the shadow wraith sent loose into the court chamber, of a sovereign who'd stepped into the chaos and yanked a centuries-old parasite from their king's bloodline with her bare hands. Naya watched the story play itself out across their faces, disbelief, dawning horror at what they'd allowed to happen to her, and then something that looked uncomfortably like reverence. They knelt, one by one, not for Darian, who was still bleeding and leaning on her shoulder hard, for her. Naya's breath caught in her chest, old instinct kicking in fast, the urge to shrink, to deflect, to insist this was too much, she wasn't worthy of this, please everyone, stand back up. This time she recognized the instinct for what it was, and let it pass through her instead of commanding her. She was tall, and she revealed herself. Rise, she said at last, her voice carrying without effort across the courtyard, steady and clear. I don't need you on your knees. I need you honest. That's all I've ever asked of this court, and it's the one thing I was never given. The nobles got up slowly, and Naya saw that something in their collective expression was forever altered. Not fear exactly, though there was a little of that, but respect, well-earned and undeniable sincere. The Spirit Walker Queen, someone whispered from the back of the gathering, and the title ran through the courtyard like a current, taken up and repeated, each repetition cementing it more firmly into truth. Darian rose to his feet beside her, winced at the movement, but was now steady enough on his own. She saved this pack, he said, and his voice had the particular authority of a king who no longer had to raise it to be heard. She decided to save us all, even when I let her down. That's not a debt that can be easily repaid. It begins, tonight, with this court finally seeing her for who she is. Naya looked across the courtyard at the faces that had once looked at her humiliation with no protest, and now looked back at her with something that finally looked like the truth she had spent her whole life hiding from them. She thought of a girl of 7, told that what she was could only ever be shame. That girl had been mistaken. Or rather, everyone who'd ever told her that had been wrong, and it just took this long, and this much, for the truth to finally be loud enough to drown them out. Thank you, she said softly, to no one and everyone at once, and she meant it more than she'd meant anything in a very long time. They were alone together, on the same balcony where Darian had once fumbled a cuffs clasp, 3 years ago, and laughed at his own clumsiness in the dark. The court was quiet for the night, the detritus of the day being wheeled away below, and Nia leaned on the stone railing next to a man she was still, in some ways, learning to trust again. Not because he had asked her to, but because he'd finally given her real reasons to. I want to break the old bond, she said, watching his face carefully as she spoke. Something crossed his face, not panic, but close enough that she seized his hand before he could go too far down that road. Let me finish, she said softly. The bond that the court put upon us at birth, before either of us had any say in the matter. That bond is gone. It has to be gone. I won't build whatever comes next on top of something neither of us chose. Darian swallowed, nodded slowly, but his eyes were still watchful. And then? He said gently. Nia turned to face him fully, calling on the last thread of the Veil Throne's power still humming quiet and patient beneath her skin. The old bond, 3 months old, patched up only by fear and grief in a training yard, beat weakly between them, a tether neither had ever chosen. She softly folded her hand on it and let it go. This time the release was not violent. It simply died out, silent and complete, as if at last allowed to rest after 300 years of service, disguised as fate. Darian's breath caught, his hand crushing hers for a moment as the old tether vanished between them completely. It's gone, he said, and there was something like grief and relief in his voice, tangled together. It's not here, said Nia. This bond is no longer owed to either of us. I'm not giving it back because a law says I should, or because a court expects it, or because it's simply easier than starting over. She held his gaze firmly. I'm offering it. I pick you, freely, if you will pick me the same way. Darian didn't answer right away. He simply looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across his face, the careful king's composure entirely absent. I choose you, he said finally, voice rough. Not the crown, not stability, not whatever's easiest for a court to accept. You, exactly as you are, exactly as you've become, for as long as you'll let me prove I mean it. Nia felt something warm bloom slowly beneath her ribs, not the old bond, forced and inherited, but something new settling into the space it left behind, built one honest choice at a time, instead of one careless law. She lifted her hand, and this time, when the new bond formed between them, it didn't feel like a chain. Weeks passed, and the Silverthorn court slowly morphed into something Naya barely recognized from the place that had once condemned her. Seraphine's trial had been swift, her sentence unlike any ever passed down in court. Exile, but not to some distant packland, but down through the very gate she'd once used as a weapon against the woman she'd tried to destroy. The Necropolis now had rules Naya had spent 3 months learning, and Seraphine would spend the rest of her days learning them from the other side, without borrowed power, fully and permanently mortal among the dead she'd tried to command. The Veil Throne was no longer buried in the earth, gathering dust in some forgotten vault. Naya divided her time between the court above and the Necropolis below. The gate between them opened now for the first time in 300 years, not a boundary to be feared, but one she crossed freely, carrying her people's grief and their dead in equal steady measure. She stood at the gate now, the evening soft and gold across the tree line, watching wraiths pass easily between worlds that had spent centuries pretending to be separate. She found him there, as she often did these days, his steps unhurried, his presence not something she needed to brace herself against any longer. The council session ran too long, he said, sitting down beside her at the railing. Half of them still want to build you a whole wing of the bloody castle just for the spirit-walking business. Told them you'd have views on that. I have a lot of opinions on that, Naya said, and found without really trying that she was smiling. He took her hand and she gave it to him. The new bond between them lay warm and steady where the old had once lain cold and imposed. He hesitated. Do you regret it? He said gently. Any of it? The trial, the Necropolis, all it cost you to become this? Naya considered the question straight, turning it over as she had learned to turn over everything now, without flinching from whatever answer she found underneath. No, she said at last. It cost me almost everything I thought I was, but it gave me back the one thing that mattered more. She looked at him, steady and unguarded in a way the girl who had knelt in that court chamber never could have. It gave me, all of it, not the version anyone else was comfortable with. Darian lifted her hand and pressed a slow kiss to her knuckles, never taking his eyes off of hers. Then I'm grateful for every awful part of it, he said, because it brought me a queen worth kneeling for, instead of a bond I never earned. Below them the gate to the Necropolis stood open in the gathering dusk, no longer gray and forbidding, but glowing faint gold in the fading light, the first time Naya realized that it had ever looked like that in 300 years. She was never supposed to have to choose between the dead and the living. She was born to be the bridge, and standing here, hand in hand with a man who had finally learned how to see her, surrounded by a kingdom that had finally learned how to do the same, Naya understood, at last, that she was home in both.